Hello, I'm Pastor Hilly. Welcome to this fifth and final part of Faith Lutheran Church's Lent study series. This episode is titled Cleansing the Temple, Beginning or Ending. But before we jump into the topic, a brief reminder that during this time of social distancing, there is wonderful ministry coming out of the community we call Faith Lutheran Church in Whitehall, Ohio. Ministry that includes this very podcast. If you would like to support the ministry of faith financially, please see the link labeled Giving in the description below. Okay, now on to the cleansing of the temple. Let's start by reading the cleansing of the temple. This story appears in all four Gospels, but for the sake of time, I'll only read one of the four versions of it. So this is the account as told by St. Mark in the 11th chapter of his Gospel. Then they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." This is a well-known story from Jesus' life, a story that you might have related with during a time in your own life, maybe during a time when church programming seemed to have outweighed or overshadowed the spiritual calm or religious stillness that you sought in the sanctuary. Maybe a time when the cart had gotten in front of the horse. But what we are going to do now is consider how the four gospel writers, or the evangelists as they're called, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all report on the life and ministry of Jesus a little bit differently. And then we will look at where this story appears in the Gospels in their tellings. I believe that by looking at where we find the story's placement in Jesus' life, we will find equally interesting and equally true views of Jesus' mission and ministry on earth. So let's take a moment to remind ourselves that the four gospel writers all tell us about Jesus' life in slightly different ways. I find the easiest way to wrap my mind around their different perspectives is to consider the Nativity, the birth of Jesus, the Christmas story that we all know so well. If we read the beginning of Matthew, looking for the Christmas story, what we find is a long genealogy, a very short birth narrative. Then we have the much longer story of the visit of the wise men who are coming from afar and that sort of thing, which is then followed by the story of Joseph taking Mary and Jesus and escaping to Egypt. That's the way Matthew tells us the story. The birth is short, and it's preceded by a genealogy and followed by this very long story about the wise men who are coming and returning home by other roads, and then the Holy Family escapes into Egypt. Luke gives us a different telling. St. Luke begins his gospel also with a genealogy, but then follows that up with the visitation when the angel appears to Mary. After that, Mary goes and visits Elizabeth. Following that encounter, we have the birth of John the Baptist, followed by Zechariah's prophecy. And then, finally, when we get into the second chapter of Luke, we have the familiar nativity story of Mary and Joseph returning to Bethlehem, or on their way to be counted to Bethlehem, that great city of David, where there's no vacancy, and they end up staying and Jesus is born and put in a manger because there is no room left in the inn. That is all in the Gospel of St. Luke. Still, St. Mark gives us a different beginning. Mark skips the birth of Jesus altogether and dives directly into the earthly ministry of Jesus. Mark begins, he starts with the earthly ministry of Jesus, beginning with the preaching of John the Baptist, who is preparing the way for Jesus to come. Mark is more interested on what Jesus is doing than where Jesus came from, it seems. And then we get to St. John. St. John, as we will be quick to see here, is always the odd man out. No, I don't necessarily love that phrase. John is always standing in left field and everyone else is in right field, watching the same game, but from vastly different angles. In the beginning of John, John begins with words that will remind us of Genesis. John begins his gospel with the words, "In the beginning." Though John writes, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." John the evangelist then goes on to tell us that John the Baptist was sent to bear witness to the light, to bear witness to Jesus. So John, very much like Mark, skips the nativity altogether, but even different from Mark, John starts in a way at the beginning of Genesis, borrowing those same words, "in the beginning." He's starting his gospel, his telling of the life of Jesus, in his own time signature that's very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But that makes sense. And that makes sense the way we read the Bible, because when we read it, we see Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we call them the Synoptic Gospels. And Synoptic Gospels means that their events are described from a similar point of view. Let me repeat that. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called Synoptic Gospels. And Synoptic Gospels means they describe events in the life of Jesus from a similar point of view. There, Matthew, Mark, and Luke their similar view is similar, though, when contrasted with John's gospel. John is the boat going in the other direction. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are similar in comparison to John, who is like the child in second grade who learns how to stand on his hands where everybody else walks to lunch on their feet. There's John walking on his hands, looking at the world upside down from a different point of view. So let's remember John's cosmic setting for the beginning of his gospel, because he begins his "in the beginning," which kind of takes us back to Genesis and is very, very cosmic, unlike Matthew and Luke, who began underlining the birth of Jesus on earth. Matthew and Luke stress the role of God in the origin of the subject of the gospel, which is Jesus. So Matthew and Luke are stressing the role of God in the origin of Jesus. And Mark jumps right into Jesus' earthly ministry with no time to waste. However, John stresses the eternal status of Jesus. It seems the way that John writes that Jesus is not born, but seems to come from the cosmos. Jesus comes from the beginning, because in the beginning, Jesus was there with God. We can also see the contrast between the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, with that of John in other places as well. Consider this. Across all three Synoptic Gospels, there is one reference to the Passover celebration. It is the occasion for Jesus' trip into Jerusalem, which culminates in his arrest, trial, and crucifixion. John, however, has three Passover occasions cited. One in chapter 2, verse 13, another in chapter 6, verse 4, and a third in chapter 11, verse 55. With three Passover occasions cited, this means that in John's telling of the life of Jesus, Jesus spent more time in Judea than in Galilee. This is a remarkably different telling of the story than we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Jesus spends the majority of his time in Galilee and only on one occasion travels to Jerusalem for Passover. Now I can hear what you may be asking. Why is all this important? Well, it simply reminds us that the different gospel writers are telling us about the life and ministry of Jesus from their own individual different vantage points. And each of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all see things differently. There's an example I love to share about differing perspectives. We here at Faith Lutheran Church, there's a courtyard in the middle of the church, and it's surrounded on three sides by big picture windows that you can see from the halls and rooms in the building. So every month, on the fourth Tuesday of the month at 6:30, we have a big community event called Taco Tuesday, where we feed families and children from the neighborhood at no cost to anyone. It's just a wonderful opportunity to meet our neighbors and provide a wonderful meal for people. And a few months ago, we had a large number of middle school children, and so I divided them up into three different groups. And I had them all sit in different parts of the building so the three groups could all see the courtyard, but from different sides of the building. I had a group on the south looking into it, I had a group on the north looking into it, and I had a group on the east looking into it. I then asked the children to draw a picture of everything that they saw. I handed them colored pencils and paper and gave them 15 to 20 minutes. At the end of that time, they came back and we laid all of the pictures across a table. And we talked about how we were looking at pictures of the exact same thing. Yet every single picture was different. Some were drawn differently as some children were older or younger or had more artistic aptitude or less artistic aptitude. Some were different based on the perspective. For the kids who were sitting on the south side, they drew the things in the courtyard the way they saw them, so that the statue was in front of the bird bath. For the kids who were seated on the north side, looking into the courtyard, they drew first the bird bath, and then they drew the statue, because that's the way that they saw it. The lesson was, our vantage point impacts not only what we see, but how we see it, and in turn, how we tell other people about it, whether we are telling a story or drawing a picture. So, what does all this have to do with the cleansing of the temple? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, and then John, place the event of Jesus cleansing the temple in different places within their gospels, because they are using it to highlight or underscore different ideas that they are trying to make in the accounts that they are writing. Let's start with the synoptics. The synoptic gospels all place the cleansing of the temple as the last public event in the ministry of Jesus. By that, we mean something that Jesus did in front of a large crowd prior to Holy Week. Obviously, the crucifixion happened in front of a large crowd, but we're talking prior to Holy Week. The synoptic gospels frame the cleansing of the temples with the flipping over of the tables and the driving out of the money changers as the final straw, as far as the opponents of Jesus are concerned. This, they say, This is the act that sets off the chain of events which aims to rid themselves of this troublemaker known as Jesus. Obviously, Jesus is a threat, they seem to say. He has no care for the market or the synagogue, and he must be stopped. He must be put to death. All three of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, follow up the story of the cleansing of Jesus with a threat, and then also with the authority of Jesus being questioned by the chief priests, asking, "By what authority are you doing these things?" So directly following these stories, you hear the rumblings of the Pharisees and the chief priest, and then in all three synoptic gospels, they are followed by accounts of chief priests trying to corner Jesus by asking Jesus about his authority. Because if Jesus says he has more authority than the temple or more authority than the government at the time, then those are charges that they can use against Jesus to get him off of the street and out of their hair. On the other hand is John's gospel. And again, very much like our child who walks on their hands and sees the world upside down, John sees the world in a very different way. In John's account, the event of Jesus cleansing the temple is in fact Jesus' first public action. Now, there's a caveat here. I'm going to say that Jesus cleansing the temple is his first public action, and I'm going to exclude the wedding at Cana, Jesus' first miracle in John's gospel. But here's my logic. Whereas people are invited to a wedding, I would like to argue here that the cleansing of the temple is actually the first public event, as it happens in the middle of the temple, out in the open for everybody. And no one is invited. The people are there. For me to do something at a wedding is for me to do something in an environment where people are invited. For me to do something in a subway or a street corner or a church on a Sunday morning, those are all public spaces. So that's why I am saying that Jesus' cleansing of the temple in John's gospel is his first public act. Being at the very beginning of John's gospel, as this event happens in the second chapter, seems to suggest a trajectory for the rest of Jesus' ministry. In the synoptic gospels, Jesus' cleansing of the temple is much, much, much later in the gospels. But for John, it's in the second chapter. And so what kind of trajectory might this tell us about Jesus' ministry? Jesus, who was there in the beginning, as John tells us in his introduction, with the Father in the cosmos, has come to cleanse the faith. Jesus is upset about what the Passover and Jewish culture has become in the face of such unblinking commercialism and neglect for the holy days and the righteousness of the people. This is a line of thinking we can see and trace throughout John's gospel, especially as Jesus seems to almost lecture us like a college professor as he explains everything to everybody he runs into. But before we continue, two brief asides. The first deals with Jesus speaking as a teacher. So speaking of that, Jesus' teachings give us memorable lessons throughout John's gospel, whether he's talking to the woman at the well in chapter 14 or any of the host of any other characters. So John's telling of the cleansing of the temple is at the very end of the second chapter. It's verses 13 through 25. The second chapter ends with verse 25. It's followed, therefore, by the third chapter, where Jesus has another conversation with a different person. Jesus tries to explain baptism to a confused Pharisee by the name of Nicodemus. And throughout the first half of the third chapter is a conversation that includes the most famous Bible verse of all time, John chapter 3, verse 16. Consider that. Half a chapter after the cleansing of the temple, we have the most famous Bible verse of all time. The temple has been cleansed. Our palate has been cleansed. And now, this is the first taste of our new spirituality. For God so loved the world, he sent his only Son. Second, since John places the cleansing of the temple this early in his gospel, it's worth noting what he uses as a replacement to set off the events of Holy Week at the end of his gospel. What event causes so much chaos that it would get the chief priests and the Pharisees conspiring to kill Jesus? That event? That would be the resurrection of Lazarus. After he calls his friend from the tomb in John chapter 3, verses 38 through 44, immediately in verse 45, the plot to kill Jesus begins. But with those two brief asides out of the way, let's go back to the cleansing of the temple. Maybe we could say that the cleansing of the temple just happened twice. Maybe John is right, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke are also right. Maybe John showed up to Jerusalem, cleansed the temple, and then cleansed it again later on. It's a nice idea, but I feel that that's far too scandalous. The cleansing of the temple is too big of a deal. Too much of a reputation would have been established the first time doing it to allow culture to have done it twice. Imagine if one person walked into the Louvre and destroyed priceless works of art, and then the same person tried to walk right back into the Louvre and destroy more art. I think they would be on the do not enter list. So that's one thing to consider. Another question we could ask is, well, why did John move his account? Why did John take the cleansing of the temple from the back end of the gospel and put it in the front of his gospel? And I think that John did that to let us know what was coming ahead in the words of his gospel. John wanted us to know from the very beginning of the second chapter, or beginning of the gospel in the second chapter, that Jesus was here to shake things up and to wipe away all of the things that get in the way of genuine religiosity and spirituality. Jesus came to reset everything so that our relationships with God the Father could be based on nothing else than our relationship with God and with Jesus the Son. And so Jesus walks into the temple and he chases out the money changers and those who are selling and those who are buying, saying all of this is unnecessary. The only thing you need in the temple is the person to come because God is there. And there is nothing else that is needed. Does it matter at the end of the day if this story of the cleansing of the temple is early in the gospel or late in the gospel? Well, either way, it is a protest. It is a protest it's the protest just like the ones that were made by the prophets in the Old Testament. It's a protest made against disrespectful and irreligious use of God's house. It is a sign that the messianic cleansing of the temple is at hand. It's a sign to us that God has come. God is walking around in the person of Jesus. And the lessons that we can learn from this are put away your money changers, drive out your cattle. All that is needed here is an open heart, an open mind, open ears, and a love of one another, but most importantly, a love of God Almighty. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.